This is Situated, a podcast exploring how our surroundings shape us. And I'm your host, Sarah Robinson. Today it's my pleasure to talk to Dr. Jenny Roe. She's an environmental psychologist and the director of the Institute of Design and Health at the University of Virginia. She's a practicing landscape architect who is the principal for a major international firm. And she also writes. Her recent book, Restorative Urbanism, is one that I highly recommend. And the book she's working on now, Restorative Architecture, is one that I'm excited to read. We're meeting today in Espoo, Finland, on the campus of Alvar Aalto University. And Jenny, when I was walking over here today, noticing all the texture of the trees, the leaves, the needles, the bark, the lichen, the texture of moving water, I remembered your work and the restorative effects of all of these fractal patterns in which I'm immersed. I was wondering if we could start with that topic. Could you tell us what fractal patterns are?
A fractal is a pattern that has a self-similar repetition to it, and it has a mathematical formula behind it, and that pattern is either ever decreasing or ever increasing. So think of a pineapple, think of a snowflake, think of the vein pattern in a leaf, think of the tree branch pattern. These are examples of fractals in our everyday world. We of course don't see snowflakes, but clouds also have a fractal pattern.
So what natural thing does not have a fractal pattern?
Well, I was talking about wood earlier today. Wood does not have a fractal pattern. It has a pattern peculiar to its species. It has a grain and it has knots and it has a smell and a texture and a colour, but it does not have a fractal pattern to it. And what we know about fractals is that fractals with a mid-level complexity are restorative in terms of the benefits they bring to our mental health and well-being. There's a lot of evidence around that. But wood, because it isn't a fractal, is a much more ambiguous material. And what I'm learning is that the colour of wood, the grain of the wood, the pattern within the wood, whether it's linear, whether it's curvature, the smell of the wood, the way it's cut, the way it's dried, I'm learning a lot about wood and just how complex that is in terms of the benefits we might derive from interacting with it.
Well, that's really interesting because wood, I think one of the reasons it's so human is it's porous like our skin and it's really malleable. So depending how you treat the wood, you get many different effects. If you cut against the grain, you see a very different pattern than if you cut with the grain. You can stain a wood and it becomes a horrible surface if it's the wrong kind of stain. And I think all these associations we have with wood really affect our experience of wood.
I think it's a really interesting point you're making, Sarah, about our associations with wood. So we're here in Helsinki. We're surrounded by trees, by birch trees particularly, and rowan trees, which have their particular grain and pattern. What you see here in Finnish architecture is spruce and fir and oak. People here have grown up with wood. But let's take another context. Give me another place.
Italy.
I don't know Italy so well, but I wouldn't imagine the Italians' resonance with wood would be quite so strong as the Finns. I suspect the Italians would resonate more maybe with marble or stone. Give me some materials that
So brick, I think brick, handmade, one of the reasons everybody loves Italy. It's like almost a universal. I mean, I live there, so people say, oh, that's my favorite country and I love to go there. And I think one reason that people find it so appealing, well, at least the old towns, because everything was made by hand. So it was made with the body, for the body. Bricks are the width of a human hand, and they're not too big or else one hand couldn't lift them. Tiles, the clay tiles, are shaped. They flare out at the sides because the mold for them was the human thigh that flares at the top. So
I did not know that. That's really fascinating.
So the proportions when you're creating something by hand are different than if you don't have any of the, let's say, the constraints of the body create a more attractive building in general, because we perceive through our bodies, so we're going to find that pleasurable.
That's really interesting around scale. And someone was talking about Aalto's building Church of the Three Crosses today, and how Aalto had intended that only 2 men should carry the timber beams into that building, i.e. if you couldn't carry the materials into the building itself, there was no place for it there. Which is kind of relating to your point about body and being able to understand proportions of materials. That said, I don't know how you would build the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona with just 2 men carrying the materials. And
it's a completely different context.
Yeah.
But I was referring to why my theory of why people find Italian villages so very pleasing. You know, it's all natural materials. It's all local. It's all embedded in the site because they didn't go far to find it, generally speaking. And also, you know, it was before cars when these medieval villages were built. So they're built for, at most, a horse carriage, but for human bodies and for the pace of walking, you know, that humans walk at. Do you know of any research that studies, say, medieval towns or hand-built places?
I don't, but wouldn't that be fascinating to look into?
Where all their proportions are, the human scale by definition, because...
So there is some research I've discovered this summer around the golden section and the proportions of that, and how that there is a relationship between that and well-being. But I don't know about medieval architecture.
Well, they use the golden proportion a lot.
They do.
Yeah. Well, let's talk more about proportion. What other kind of findings? You were talking about scale earlier, how scale relates to restorative environments.
That higher ceilings support mental health and well-being. I'm talking about occasional studies. There's not a heavy body of evidence in relation to this research. I've looked a little bit at symmetry and asymmetry, and what's really interesting is people who have a design training. Are you trained as an architect?
Yes, I am an architect.
So you've been trained to look for these things in the environment compared to, let's say, a psychologist or a doctor. Their aesthetic eye doesn't quite tune in so well to proportion and geometry and form, and there's this difference in terms of our aesthetic training. So I've looked at height, I've looked at curvilinear form. We lean towards curvilinear form, partly because it's more novel. So we're here sitting out in a courtyard that is entirely rectilinear. This is the norm in our built environment. We prefer and lean towards curvilinear architecture, but some of the theory posits we lean towards it because it's got a higher novelty value. We don't experience it quite so often in our everyday. I'm trying to think when I last experienced curvature. Well, it would have been at the Udi Library in Helsinki city centre, where there's this great sweep of timber and gravity that this great beam. I don't know how you describe it. You'd be better to describe it.
I haven't been there yet, but I'm going to go.
There's a sense of gravity beneath this huge curvilinear timber structure. I would love to hear how you would describe it. And it's something about the curvature in that building that is really beautiful. And again, the theory posits around curvature is that we have, from our evolution, been around curvature for hundreds and hundreds of years, and that's another reason why we might lean towards it. These are just propositions and ideas. They haven't really been proven.
Okay, I have another proposition on the curvature effect, which is, our first experience of the world, of course, we're born from another body. And the first experience of the world we have is this smooth skin and the curved arms of another and the swaddling, cradle. I mean, the first really experience of comfort is curved.
That is so interesting. We're cocooned, aren't we? We're held. Yes. And so buildings that hold you like that, I'm really interested in. So we have both spoken about Maggie's cancer care centres. I think there are some wonderful examples in Maggie's healthcare centres of holding you and cocooning you. At Gartnavel in Glasgow, there's a circular room. It's entirely built out of timber. And it's a micro-environment. It's just for conversation between, let's say, you and a healthcare worker. It's completely confidential space, but it just invites you to sit, to meditate, to converse, to be intimate in terms of your conversation. Exactly that womb shape that you just described, that we emerge from.
And that's extremely comforting. It's got certain sonic qualities. It's got certain, I'm sure, thermal qualities too. And that's the thing that's, when we're speaking of wood earlier, wood has this wonderful thermal quality to keep the heat. It doesn't, if you touch a wood handrail, like so many of the handrails that Alvar Aalto did, you feel like, especially if they're covered in leather or wood, you feel like you're touching skin on skin. Your heat stays in your body. And the minute you go to metal, the heat goes away from you. Your hand is cold. So in this Nordic climate, that's not a trivial matter.
I agree. I think the appearance of wood warms up a setting. It does create a sense of a great thermal content to that environment. And especially important here in a Nordic country. Tactility of it.
Yeah.
Super important, but we don't really study that.
But, I think tactility needs to be taken into consideration alongside the thermal.
So what
the thermal quality. Because the minute something's cold, we don't want to touch it anymore.
So let's just run through some cold materials. So steel, glass, concrete. They're not materials I particularly want to touch.
No.
But rocks and stones and wood, slate, natural materials. These are things I do want to interact with in my environment.
Well, they have texture, each one of them. And they are fractal. I mean, the closer you look, the more complex they become. And because they have texture, they react with light in a certain way. They're full of shadows, and they have the capacity to change with the light.
They change with the light, and they also change in interaction with water. So when rain hits them, let's say rain hits slate, surface quality of that material changes. So they're dynamic. And that's partly why they are restorative in terms of they bring benefits to our mental health, because it is that dynamic interaction with light, with water.
Have you read John Hall's Touching the Rock?
No.
Well, he's a college professor of English in Australia, and he gradually loses his sense of sight. And he's a very good writer, and he's quite articulate, and he talks about this gradual loss of sight. And at first it's obviously quite distressing, but then he becomes at home in his new sensory world. And he says that when it rains, it's his favorite time because the world comes alive to him, and he can hear the sound of a hill. It sounds different. He can hear the contours, how they change. And without rain, he can't, of course.
That's phenomenal. And next time it rains, I'm going to have to close my eyes and really try and listen. It's really interesting because I think the brain can adapt, is highly malleable. It's a tragic situation, losing your eyesight, but there's an example of how his brain, his sensory perception has changed and adapted in relation to the problem with his eyesight. I find that really heartening and encouraging and hopeful.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book. It's a beautiful book. I highly recommend that book. And I wanna learn more about. So you started out as a landscape architect, and then you switched to environmental psychology. What was behind that change?
So that's an interesting story, Sarah. So I was working in deprived pockets of London, Bow, Tower Hamlets, really the most deprived, poor communities imaginable. I was working in an architectural practice. I was leading the urban design and landscape architecture program, and my budgets were being cut because the architects were going over budget. And I felt this hunch, let's say what year are we in now, 2021, 22, that if I could just make a case for the relationship between health and well-being and the outdoors and access to high quality landscape environments, it would be a winner. And that policy and the people who govern for our built environment and fund it and finance it could not argue with a health and well-being case for poorer communities. So that's what led me to environmental psychology. I think it also coincided with a period in a hospital setting where the view from the window was of a car park. And I became acquainted with Roger Ulrich's research. For your listeners who don't know that research, Roger Ulrich is a Swede who went to the US, and a very famous study was about the view from the window. And what he showed in a very small sample of only, I think, 9 patients, was that the patients who had a view of trees recovered faster, required less pain medication, and were out of hospital quicker than the patients whose room looked out onto a brick wall. And that's what I faced in hospital. Therefore, I became really interested in the research. So it was the kind of combination and the syncing of those two events that took me into environmental psychology.
And his research has really changed hospital design.
He has. He produced a big evidence review in 2012, I think. We were asked to update it a few years ago by HKS Architecture, who were building a healthcare facility actually in Virginia, down the road from where I'm based. And he was very focused on hospital architecture. We actually have done a really interesting study, Sarah. I think I'm allowed to announce this.
Oh, that's exciting.
There's been a global experiment with labs of environmental psychology around the world who've replicated a very famous Roger Ulrich study, which was looking at stress and elements of green space. It was done using 2D imagery. I mean, now we have much more sophisticated technology, but we replicated the experiment and we took a whole suite of physiological metrics. And it's just been written up. It's taken, let's think, 2018. How many years is that? It's about 7 years?
Yeah, 7 years.
To get to this point.
Wow.
And it's just about to go to publication for peer review. So I can't say too much about the results. But I think that this is the nature of future environmental psychology research, the importance of replication. So his study in the hospital has never been replicated.
Okay.
Some of my own work has never been replicated. It's partly about budget, it's partly about constraints, economic constraints, but I think the idea of 8 labs around the world coming together to try and replicate a really famous study, and Roger Ulrich was part of the advisory team. I think that's exciting.
Oh, that's exciting and so important. I mean, there's the proof, but it's all, as you were saying earlier, some of the resistance you receive from architects is that these studies seem all too obvious. Of course, green space makes us feel better. Why should this be anything surprising?
Well, of course, they call it research of the blindingly obvious. And what I say is, well, it may be blindingly obvious to you as a trained architect and practitioner in architecture for very many years, but it is not blindingly obvious to people who govern for our built environment, who create our policies at a global, national, state level in public health. It's not obvious to medical practitioners, to people in public health. So we really do need evidence that shows how greenery and nature and access to nature in our cities supports our mental health and well-being. I'm really a passionate advocate of evidence-based design that draws on systematic and very robust research. That's my raison d'etre. That's what I do.
Yes. And with that research, you hope to change policy.
I have changed policy.
Could you give us some examples?
I think in Scotland we have a very unique place-based health policy. I think my research in Scotland has contributed to that focus on place-based health. It's one of the few countries in the world that I think has a national policy on place and health. And we were asked by the Chief Medical Officer in Scotland through a Scottish government-funded research project to go and look at cortisol and show the relationship between cortisol and our environment. Cortisol, for your listeners, is a biomarker of stress, and it has a diurnal pattern over a 24-hour cycle, and it should follow a certain gradient and concentration. So that's what we did, and we found in very deprived parts of Dundee in central Scotland that higher levels of green space in the environment, controlling for a whole host of demographic and socioeconomic variables, higher levels of green space produced improved stress regulation as indicated by those diurnal cortisol profiles. Now that piece of research alone hasn't changed policy, but other pieces of research we've done in combination with the growing evidence around green space and mental health and well-being globally has shifted Scottish policy. So we now talk about green prescriptions. They're really commonplace in Scotland. So let's say you're suffering from depression. You have been suffering from depression for 12 years. The doctor's run out of medications to give you. What happens now in Scotland, if the doctor can't prescribe a different type of antidepressant to help you, he will say, Sarah, I suggest you go for a walk in green space. And here's an organisation, they're called Pastor Health. They can support you. You can join a walking programme, or you can go walk alone, depending upon your need to be with people or to be alone. So there's a whole host of these types of green prescriptions in Scotland and agencies that are supporting people to get walking in green space. We're very fortunate in Scotland. We do have some very lovely green spaces.
You have beautiful green space, and that's great that it's become so fundamental. It sounds like Japanese forest bathing as a prescription.
Absolutely, and there are a number of countries around the world doing this. Canada has a very similar program around green prescriptions. I think in Australia and New Zealand, similarly. So we've seen them grow, but I honestly think that Scotland started this before anybody else. But that's because we worked with the Chief Medical Officer. We listened to him.
So one visionary person working with many qualified and smart researchers, is that what happened? Or am I giving him too much credit?
I think possibly you are, because he said go away and do a cortisol study. We had to think about how to do it and what we wanted to show. But he gave us the motivation to do it. It was difficult research because taking cortisol measurements in people who are highly stressed, who are unemployed in deprived parts of Scotland is probably the biggest achievement of my research career, because they are very disorganised through no fault of their own. And cortisol measurement requires you to take a saliva swab every 3 hours over the course of a day, 4 times a day. So to get 110 or 20 people to do that, I think was pretty phenomenal.
That's an achievement in and of itself. But what about areas that don't have green space close by, and people who don't have cars to get to a park that's outside of the city limits?
Well, that's the case in America. You can't get to a national park in America unless you've got a car. I'm all for bringing green space into the city, even micro-level green space. So there's been some superb studies showing, let's say in Chicago, how the greening of vacant parking lots has improved mental and social well-being. In Sheffield, Nigel Dillon's work using naturalistic planting on any spare vacant piece of land around the city is not only reducing the stigma of deprivation in some of those communities, but it's supporting mental health and well-being. So it takes an army of people to do this, and it takes a real sense of motivation and belief that greening these vacant plots can really make a difference, but they do make a difference. So I'd say any space, even balconies, small, tiny front gardens, backyards, front yards, greening them, even at a micro level, has a huge effect on our physiology and on our felt experience of stress.
And also, what about actively gardening? Doesn't that release oxytocin? Contact with the soil, like organisms in the soil?
I believe it does. I'm not an expert on gardening. I haven't investigated that in my research. I know that people have, and I think you're completely correct there. But I can't speak to that.
Because there's this whole element of care, because, okay, plants, we all like plants, but we don't like dead plants, and we don't like plants that aren't tended. So is that part of it? In urban areas, it also gives you this sense that somebody's taken the time and care to create this garden.
I think any initiative in the urban environment that's communal, that brings people together to create something, is really important in terms of what I call place keeping, about maintaining a sense of place, of belonging to that place, of love of place. So where I live in Edinburgh, there's a tiny plot of wildflowers that have been planted and sown by school children. I walk past it on the way to the supermarket. We have those little sporadic, I call them urban acupuncture events. They're just tiny, but they pierce away, and together they add up to something much bigger.
Do you have other examples of urban acupuncture? That's a very interesting, compelling idea.
Well, getting away from plants for a minute, I would say that murals are another example of urban acupuncture. That can again really reduce stigma in a city. So Richmond, Virginia, not far from where the University of Virginia is, there's a huge program of murals which are connected and formulate trails, and they just help bring fascination and curiosity and wonder into a setting where perhaps there isn't scope for planting. There isn't the maintenance regime to support planting. I don't think it necessarily has to be about plants all the time.
I've been thinking a lot about rhythms, and how I earlier talked about texture, how nothing in nature is not textured. But also, everything alive is rhythmic. And I wonder about the restorative effects of rhythms, because everything that you cite as being restorative is rhythmic in nature. You talk about also blue spaces. And the one thing about water is that it moves, it changes state according to the temperature. It freezes, or it melts, or it becomes mist. It has so many personalities. It's so mutable, but it's also so reflective and constantly in motion. What do you think about that?
I think it's getting back to that quality of being dynamic. You mentioned it just now. So our trees change in terms of seasonality. Water, as you've said, it changes in response to light. The surface of the material it flows under, its rhythm, its sound can be powerful. It can drown out traffic, or it can be gentle. It can be a trickle. Water is actually one of the most restorative attributes that we have to play with. Children love it. People love to interact with it. But it's high maintenance, or it can be if it's not naturalistic. So again, just going back to Sheffield and Nigel Dunlop's work, I mean, he's creating these rain gardens. He's creating gardens that will absorb and mop up water to prevent flooding, but they're also very, very beautiful in terms of their naturalistic planting. I think we have to think a little bit more about sustainability and water. I love fountains in cities. I'm sure you have many examples from Italy of beautiful fountains that we could talk about. And children love to interact with it. So I don't want to suggest we remove it from a city, but I think we have to think about sustainability. Where is it in America where there are so many of Halprin's water features? Is it Portland. And I think that was a wonderful example of rhythm and choreography of water drawing on the naturalistic landscape of would it be the Rocky Mountains?
He was very moved by the high Sierras because he was from the East Coast and he relocated to California. So the whole Sierras go up all the way up to Oregon. And another interesting thing about the Portland open space is that, well, you know, his wife, Anna Halprin, was a dancer. And they had a woman who was an architect. She was from Bulgaria. She was a theater designer. And she was actually the main lead designer on the Portland open space. And it's very theatrical. So this collaboration with theater, dance, and nature created this really powerful space, and he conceived it to be this town swimming hole, and the opening day he took off his suit and jumped in the water with everybody.
I think it was wonderful bringing together of disciplines to create something very rhythmic and very memorable and powerful. I'm just not sure how sustainable it is in 2023.
Yes, and you're right, and I wanted to include that project in our film, but it wasn't turned on.
Why was it not turned on?
It wasn't turned on because it takes a lot of energy.
I'm sure.
Even if you recirculate the water and for people to use it, because another issue, speaking of sustainability, is places for people to cool off in urban areas. And fountains are wonderful places to cool off if you don't have access to a lake or a river or, you know, a body of water that's natural. So that's another thing we need to think about. But how do we do that in a way that's, you know, economical with energy use, water use, and accessible and inclusive at the same time?
And safe.
And safe.
Because a lot of parents get very paranoid about even tiny, tiny millimetre depths of water in children potentially drowning. I think the other thing with Portland is the amount of chemicals that are required to keep that water clean so that children can interact and touch it. So it's problematic, but we have to work through these problems. I think there are sustainable solutions in terms of rain gardens. I think that they can have water flowing through them at certain times. Not all the time, but they can still look beautiful.
Yes. And also using materials in a way that mimics water, reflectivity, and movement.
So I saw it today in an interior. So it was simulated nature, I think we'd call it. And so the rocks of this particular building were a feature of the external landscape, but the rocks have been taken into the interior, and within the interior there was water, running water being projected onto the rocks. So it looked a little bit like a waterfall. I would have loved to have had sound added to that, because I could have sat there, I think, in a cozy chair and just believed I was somewhere else.
But also thermal, we were talking about thermal qualities. That's going to cool off the area.
It does.
It's like A swamp cooler does exactly that.
A swamp?
Yeah, it's a cooler they use in desert climates. They just water has a cooling effect on the air temperature.
So I'm thinking of the Alhambra now in Granada as you talk, and how there's a whole network of water features in the Alhambra in Granada in southern Spain that is so cooling. And they're not big features, they're little rills that run between larger water bodies. It's beautiful, but it's also extremely cooling.
Yes, and the way the fountains are arranged, they're in the center, and then the buildings are formed around them so that it uses natural convection currents to cool off water as it comes. So hot air is drawn over the fountain and it cools on its passage to another space. So these desert climates, they came up with these solutions in the crucible of this extreme desert climate, and we need to study these vernacular techniques.
I completely agree. I don't know if you caught the lecture with Grafton Architects today, but they were saying very much that we really need to understand climatic processes in terms of managing climate change and the problems it's causing us.
Well, let's talk about going back to restorative, environments, restorative urbanism. Now you're studying restorative architecture. How can we bring these natural elements in that have all these qualities? They have, they're emotionally soothing. They have this deep sort of existential, our relationship with water is more than emotional. It's existential. Clean water it changes, even if you swim, you defy gravity when you swim. It takes the stress off your skeleton. It makes you into it's a completely different rhythmic environment.
So I am a swimmer, and I swim in the sea, mostly the North Sea, and what I love about it is that sense of lightness of being. You're floating, you're being moved. Well, you're moving because you're swimming, but also the water is moving you along. I don't know, I just thought of it when you talked about gravity just now and being able to escape that sometimes and just being light in yourself. For me and my well-being, that's super important. But where were we before that?
Well, we were talking about the depth of our attraction to these elements. I think our depth of attraction to things like water, clean air, seeing, it's one thing to see a tree, it's another thing to hear it and feel the breeze and to walk beneath it on a sunny day and feel the change of temperature. I think all of these non-visual elements, the more we understand them, the more we can bring those into our built environments.
So I agree completely, and one of the reasons I do what I do in terms of synthesizing evidence is I really want to make a case for better quality environments, particularly in communal settings. So I'm not really interested in private residential housing. I'm interested in social housing and how we can make that more equitable and more inclusive and bring a higher quality of standard materials to social housing, to libraries, to schools, to public buildings.
What have you discovered in your research for your next book, Restorative Architecture?
So it's fascinating. So I'm looking at a whole host of multisensorial attributes. So I'm looking at the evidence around colour and well-being, light, biophilic criteria. I would say those three are the most well evidenced. But as I've touched upon earlier, I'm looking at building form, I'm looking at pattern, I'm looking at symmetry and asymmetry, I'm looking at texture and grain, I'm looking at wayfinding and navigation through buildings, I'm looking at scent and smell and sound. And I'm finding more than I thought I would, actually, in terms of the relationship of those elements and people's psychological restoration.
So are you doing literature, review.
It's huge. It's a huge task.
And you're doing many site visits too.
I am. I'm doing the literature review first. I'm here in Helsinki, so I'm certainly looking at sites here in Helsinki, including schools. I went to a residential care home. But I'm really trying to sync together all the evidence. It takes hours and hours of work to do that lit review and then isolate the research and try to fuse it and bring it together. I work with the most wonderful illustrator, Spring Butterbeck. She's an architect. She was one of my former students, and she and I just seem to have a relationship that works. And she's able to take the design ideas from the research and translate them into these little sketches that I just think are so incredibly joyful. And the idea is not to give architects strict design principles or rules. They don't work with architects. That's not the idea. The idea is that people can take them and make them fit and suit particular people's needs and contexts. So with restorative cities, the Flemish Institute for Health has taken the ideas and they asked if they could redo the drawings to suit the context of Flemish building typologies and their context. So we said, yes, no problem. We're delighted for them to be able to use that research in that way. So I would love for restorative architecture to follow that. I have a slight doubt about it though, Sarah, which I'm going to share with you.
Tell me.
It's partly to do with the architectural ego. And restorative cities was really taken up by people in policy and urban design. They valued the evidence. They valued the principles. But I was talking to a couple of architects just the other day in Finland, and I thought, gosh, I don't know if architecture is going to be such a willing and receptive audience. I'm amongst friends here in Helsinki. The community that we're part of through Moving Boundaries is very bought into this idea. But I do think some architects don't want to really think about evidence-based design. They think maybe they know it. It's intuitive. It's getting back to that problem we were saying earlier about research of the blindingly obvious. So I don't know how this new book's going to be. My hope is that the evidence can leverage better quality environments in social contexts, social architecture. But will it? I don't know.
Well, I think your way of presenting it is very important, and you know that. You're working with an architect to make these visual ideas, because that's going to be architects. If we are so aesthetically driven that if the font is wrong, we're not going to like it. Talk about priming, it's just because we care so much about how things look, not only how they look, but how they feel and how they are. But we have gone beyond, hopefully, this architecture as a personal statement. Johanni was saying the other day, young architects are making, their fault is that they make these personal statements. And he said, I don't want anybody living in my personal statement. But if you look around the 80s, 90s, 2000s, architecture was flaunted as a personal statement. It was flaunted as a brand. And if you want that brand, get the architect who makes that brand, who will replicate it in your city, a city near you, and bring the tourists in. In the case of Frank Gehry and others we could name. But so there is this aesthetic part, but it's also this idea that architecture is an art form, which it is also an art form. But the fundamental problem that I think we tend to forget is that we're creating habitats for animals. And no one person can create a habitat for an animal. You have to understand their perceptual systems, their evolutionary history, how they evolve, their developmental needs, So it's complex.
It's complex, but I do agree with you. You need to understand it if those animals are going to thrive in the environments we create for them.
So it's not enough to have triangle windows or even asymmetry. I mean, we need to have environments in which we dwell in a coupled way that we interact with. And I think agency is hugely important. We were talking about agency earlier.
And to be able to control your environment, to be able to pull the shades down or turn the temperature up, down at your workstation. Definitely we need control.
And I do think that the more limits there are, the better the design can be. And one talent of architects is we're great at constraints, working within constraints. And one other shout out I want to give to architects, being one myself, is that we're the last standing generalists. Every other field has gone into these specializations, but architects have to be educated to be generalists because we have to understand structural engineering, acoustics, landscape architecture. Now we have to understand human needs, So all these knowledges coming together, that takes a certain kind of approach and a certain skill at being able to kind of blend together various opposing factors and finding, it's not innovation, it's the adaptation, really.
So I think hearing you talk there, two thoughts come to mind. I don't think you're the only professional generalist. I think doctors, GPs.
Yeah, GPs. But that's a good analogy because they go and if they have a question, they send you to a specialist.
But also, if you have a question in terms of construction, you're going to have to consult a specialist engineer. So even within architecture, I am an advocate for specialists, and being a landscape architect, I can speak to that piece because quite often, as I said earlier, our budgets will be cut, and the architects thought they could actually do the landscape architecture themselves to save fees. Same with interior architecture. It's actually a specialism.
Yes, but let's keep with the analogy of the family doctor. I would say that we're in the category like a family doctor who knows enough of all these different disciplines to be able to interpret the results and know the next specialist to send you to.
Do you not think
it's
some of
integrative? It's an integrative role.
I agree with that, but do you not think a good doctor, maybe like a good architect, works with their intuition? Yes, they need to know the speciality, but sometimes they need to use their intuition to figure out what's actually going on.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. To read between the lines, to figure out what's not being said, to give ultimately the client more than they ever dreamed of. I mean, that's the goal.
That's the goal.
Earlier today, you talked about developing a human-centered manifesto. And I want to talk about this idea of human-centered design because I know what you mean by it. It's taking human needs into consideration, human perceptual systems. But it seems to me, the more we learn about restorative environments, design for flourishing, that it's the non-human things that are making us, that we need to connect to more. Trees, nature, air.
But they're dynamic, living things that change their quality over the course of a day. I always remember this comment from a cancer patient at Maggie's. And this Maggie's in Gartnavel was surrounded by nature. And it was the kind of transitory nature of vegetation and its change that gave her hope. That even though she was going through this diagnosis and treatment for cancer, the living material outside that she was looking at was promoting hope because it did renew itself. It died and then it came back. So I think that's a very deep connection between us and other living matter.
So I have a problem with human-centered for the exact reason you said. Is it more life-centered? Because it's focusing so much on the humans has been our demise.
I like the idea of life-centered. The reason I used human-centered in that presentation today was because, honestly, I'm really trying to understand what wording resonates with architects, because I talk about environmental psychology in my School of Architecture. It doesn't resonate. I talk about design thinking. That resonates a bit more. I talk about restorative environments. It doesn't really resonate with more than a handful of architects. So I am hoping human-centered design might speak to the need to design from a human perspective, but it's not working. So I like the idea of life-centered design.
Or life promoting, because there's many disciplines gathering around this, idea that we need to include other species. And I think including other species, if there's a bottom line to what you're doing, it's that.
I agree entirely. So part of my mantra is healthy planet, healthy people. If you're promoting biodiversity, if you're promoting environments that butterflies and birds and insects can live happily within, then you're promoting a much healthier planet for us to live in. So I like that notion of life-centered design. Should we call it that from now on?
I'm fine with it. We can go forward with that. I think human-centered loses a really important audience, a really important group who can get behind these ideas, who are behind these ideas, but the terminology of human-centered is still referring to this, what's now an exhausted paradigm.
I think you're right, it's exhausted. I'm clutching at straws because the paradigms I use in my own discipline are not resonating. I'm going to try life-centered design because I think it speaks to sustainability, and for some architects that may be the main motivation of their work, but there are a whole load of co-benefits to mental health and well-being that come with it. So I don't really care what drives the greening of our cities, I just care that it happens.
Yes. And there's so many reasons to do it. Some of the sustainability obvious things are, or maybe it's not so obvious, that there's a heat island effect in cities. Without trees, they get vastly more. They heat up so quickly, and they don't, trees breathe. They're breathing out oxygen. They're breathing out moisture constantly. So they're actually moistening the air when you're around them. Not to mention all the shade they provide, all the multi-species hospitality they offer.
And all the toxins they're mopping up that we humans are creating through our cars. They're acoustic. They provide a barrier to sound, to noise. There's so many functions.
Yes, and they're beautiful.
And dynamic. That quality we keep coming back to.
So earlier in your definition of health, you said that, 20 to 50% of health has to do with environmental factors?
If you look at the role of the built environment in terms of healthy behaviour, so the relative contribution of the built environment to health, and I'm talking about health here generally, public, mental, physical health, the role of the built environment is put to be around 10%. But what we know is that the placing of, let's say, a park will encourage people in that neighbourhood to be more physically active. So like physical activity also supports mental health. So health is a holistic concept. You can't really separate mental health from physical activity or from social well-being. But when we take those patterns of behaviour into consideration, the impact of the built environment, its impact leaps up between 20 to 50%.
So this is something Yohani mentioned during his lecture about how more than individual differences, situations will dominate people's behavior. In other words, there's a certain behavior of going into a courthouse or going into a school or going into a store, and that determines people's behavior more than any individual difference among the people.
I agree and disagree with that. I think individual difference does determine some behaviours and your cultural response to a particular context. I'm trying to think of an example, but people who are extroverts are drawn to situations where there are a lot of people congregating. I, as an introvert, are repelled from those spaces, so I would never even engage with a busy shop or a busy environment if I didn't have to go to it. I would push away, I'd avoid it. I'd go back at a later time of day. So I think personality and individual difference does play into this. I don't think we've researched it enough around the role of personality. I think, again, if you're more open to experience another character trait, you're more likely to embrace novel environments you haven't perhaps been in before. Whereas if you're not open to those new experiences, you're more neurotic, you're going to withdraw from those types of interactions. So I'm half with the idea and half not.
What is the most surprising finding you've discovered?
I think it's pretty phenomenal that people's diurnal stress patterns change in response to the level of green space. And we've shown that across 2 studies. I think that's probably the most fundamental and most exciting piece of research I've done. It doesn't surprise me that people's brainwave activity, that their alpha activation changes from the green space, but that their actual stress physiology over a 24-hour cycle changes. I think that's really interesting.
That is profound. That's profound. Well, would you attribute that to the fact that we evolved in nature and we're ourselves part of nature?
That's what the biophilic hypothesis would suggest, that we are hardwired to connect with nature. It's part of our evolution. It's how we've adapted. So that explains partly our connection to nature. But I wonder about this a little bit, because you and I are probably very fortunate in that we've been brought up around nature. I grew up in Yorkshire, around nature with Scottish parents. I don't know where you grew up, but I was very privileged to be able to walk in nature and to appreciate and learn of its value. As a child, I'd go off and I'd draw wildflowers. I was just immediately connected to it. But some kids just don't get that chance, right? They don't get the chance to be around nature because it's not equitably distributed amongst various neighbourhoods. They don't get to interact with animals, farm animals, cows, sheep. So I hesitate to really give a full response to that because I can't articulate what it's like as a child to not grow up with nature. All I know is it's super important, and that schooling and school yards and playgrounds can, I think, be a leveller, because I think if they are green and they provide spaces for many species, other types of animals, birds, butterflies, I think that they can provide an environment which is helping level out that environmental inequity that I just spoke about.
For example, you were saying that in Finland, in schools, children spend 30% of their time outside.
People come here to Finland to study their educational system. I'm sure they look at all factors within a school setting, including the teacher training, qualifications, the way teachers deliver the curriculum. But I have this hunch that the fact that children spend 30% of their time outdoors every day, no matter what the season or how cold it is a factor in their success.
I would too. I mean, I grew up in Minnesota next to a woods. So I lived in the woods. That was my playground. You mentioned a brutalist building, so
in Sheffield.
Yes, so even interventions that aren't just with nature, but what are some other restorative interventions?
That are not with nature?
Yeah, yes.
Well, I talked about murals and colour.
What did they do to that building to make it?
They added colour.
They added colour.
And they added identity. So in each of those flats, we're talking about a huge concrete brutalist structure called Park Hill in Sheffield. It was modelled on Corbusier's idea of streets in the sky. The problem is, in the 1960s, they put the wrong people in this brutalist structure. They put families with children. Children need to be around open spaces and need to be able to play where their parents can see them. And it fell into disrepute, and it was sold, 10, 15 years ago for £1 to a company called Urban Splash, and now it's been nominated for an RIBA award in the UK. And they've brought colour into it, and they've brought identity into it. So what's really interesting, I wish I could show you a photograph, is outside each flat, they built a little window where you could display an object or a series of objects that characterize the self or your family.
Ooh, interesting.
So what would I'm going to ask you, Sarah, what would characterize, in terms of a selection of objects that might fill a small window, a panel, what might that be for you?
Well, I would always go back to plants. I'm a plant person. I love plants.
I didn't see any plants. I saw books. I saw trinkets. I saw posters. I didn't see any plants in the window. So that's really interesting, isn't it? But I really like the idea that amongst this vast population, I don't know how many people are housed in those flats, thousands probably, there's a chance to personalise and create your own identity. And I think they put the right people in it this time.
Who are?
Well, I think it's mostly young millennials who live there. I didn't see very many families when I was there.
Yeah.
Or older people.
Yeah.
Older people and millennials, they work very well together.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of community.
Yeah, and it's multi-generation. That's healthy.
I agree. So it's definitely worth a visit. It really is something. There's something kind of awesome about it in terms of its scale and the success. The other thing they did, Sarah, I'm just remembering, is on the lower ground floor they put shops in. So it brings a sense of life to the street. I'm thinking Jane Jacobs here.
Yeah.
And the ballet of a street and how you need to have street life on the ground floor.
Yes. Mixed use. Okay, speaking of this sociality that seems to have developed there, how do restorative environments promote pro-sociality? That's one of your key findings.
So we're just beginning to research that. I don't think we have the answers, but what the research has shown, for instance, there was a study, if you dropped a $10 note in a public park, somebody was much more likely to come pick it up and give it to you, run after you, say, hey, here's your $10 note, than if it just happened on a grey urban street. So there's something about the collective consciousness, and I'm going to try and unpick it a bit for this new book. What's going on there? Is nature making us more aware of our sense of self in society? I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I was very intrigued by your idea of this collective unconscious. You know, of course it's not a new idea, but it's sort of been discredited over time. And even using the word unconscious, you know, you have to qualify it with 10 other words in front of it. So let's say, but we do have this shared collective consciousness. Let's say it's not even unconscious. It's this shared collective consciousness that, well, I think maybe what has to do with it is there's all this interesting research, which you likely know about, on interpersonal synchrony and how we're synchronizing right now probably on a number of different physiological levels. Our brain waves are probably synchronizing. People in good conversations, they can tell just by what's happening inside their brains. And so I think we extend beyond ourselves. I mean, we know this physically.
We do. I'm puzzled about it. I think nature maybe brings the best out of us. And it's about that interconnection.
Well, what about these levels of resonance we're having between each other, between, natural elements?
I need to think about that a bit more.
Because everything that's rhythmic either entrains or synchronizes or resonates. Or couples, if they have shared similarities. So maybe these shared, I'm wildly speculating here, but maybe these shared similarities create a more cohesive sense of self that goes outside of our skin. It enlarges us in a way.
I think that is related to the idea of awe and what awe can do in the everyday. So you don't need to go to a national park to experience nature and awe. It's evident in the fractal patterns of a leaf or a tree. But awe takes us out of ourself into a different place where we're aware much more of our connection to a vaster universe. So that might be what's going on. In terms of social relationships, we have a much greater sense of where we fit in the world.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Situated. Tune in next time for more conversations exploring how our surroundings shape us.